Welcome to The Bottom Line on Brownfield, brought to you by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. Today, we're going to dig into a couple of areas that we don't always focus on when we're talking about the bottom line: labor and land. Joining us today, University of Missouri livestock economist Scott Brown and Don Close, Chief Research and Analytics Officer for Terrain. Hello, gentlemen.
Morning.
Hello, Megan.
We're going to get right into this. I think this is a really interesting perspective when we're talking about profitability in the cattle industry, in the livestock industry, because I think some of these challenges probably carry over into other species as well. Don, I'm going to start with you. When we look at the labor situation in the United States, in the ag sector and in the cattle industry specifically, what are the current bottlenecks that we're seeing?
Wow, many. The shortage of just available labor in general. But Matt Clark, who's an economist at Terrain, did a very interesting study where he looked at employment levels on a county level across Kansas. And so when we see a national average number of something of 3 to 4%, when you get into these rural counties, you're talking zero available unemployment, or in some cases negative available employment numbers that you're having to import people from other counties to fill jobs. And the bottom line of that is the stress in the rural economies for available labor is substantially tighter than it is in the metropolitan areas or in the general economy overall. So the short of this, I don't think there's going to be any easy fixes at all short term. If we look, okay, so let's start looking at a broader picture. First off, I think it's going to ultimately force the United States to finally address our border situation, our immigration policy, and make it more available for labor to come into the U.S. A second avenue I would go down, I think we really need to revamp the H-2A program and try to make that thing more user-friendly, that those guys are not having to leave the country for a couple of months every year, that they could stay here, even bring their families with them. The third point I would bring up, Megan, is that I think it is going to force automation into agriculture at an even faster rate than what we will see it in many industries, just because we won't have a choice. I mean, that invention is from necessity, and we're quickly getting there.
Does that, and I know we're talking about this in terms of bottom line in the producer segment, but does that also make things, if we're incorporating more mechanical into like the processing side of things, does that reduce some of the availability of some of those specialty things that consumers are buying as well? Does it change our ability to provide the products that consumers want, and and then thinking about that on the demand side?
Well, I think it will, and if you look at the level of mechanization that is going into processing facilities today, and that was certainly exacerbated from the whole COVID experience, that I think we're already seeing that. The other thing I thought about this question, when you talk about self-driving equipment, when you talk about precision farming and field monitoring and all, I think the row crop side is probably further down that mechanization road than we in general agriculture even think about. Where I see the real transition coming from here is that level of automation will increasingly make its way into animal agriculture. We're already seeing the examples of the new dairies where the cows select when they want to be milked instead of on a timed rotation. Those systems are fully automated. You know, the question I've had for years is, why haven't we gone to self-driving feed trucks and feed yards? They're going the exact same route twice a day or 3 times. So I think there's opportunities there that we will be seeing in the not distant future.
Scott, you and I talk a lot about unemployment in terms of demand and the benefit for the industry, because there's a constant, a constant buyer, constant market. On the flip side of that, thinking about that on the farm level and in the ag sector for production, how challenging is that when getting employees is becoming so competitive in things, whether it's in the supply chain or whether it's on-farm employees as well?
Well, I think you're certainly seeing the wage rates for those workers going up. I often say, I think one of the bigger issues, however, though, is that you find these operations, whether you're at the farm level or at the processing level, the amount of training cost, because you got such high turnover happening all the time, you're always in training mode. And that training is not costless because, unfortunately, if someone comes for a week and works at your farm or at your plant, that they could choose the next day to go somewhere else. That they can, it's very mobile right now in terms of where do I want to work at. I just think that adds additional cost to whatever level of processing that we're talking about, all the way from the farm to the retail level. For those that aren't training a lot of employees or need a lot of employees, that training cost may be even more difficult for them to deal with. The whole conversation about automation, which I completely agree with, leads me to say there's economies of scale likely with this automation. And all of a sudden we change the structure of animal agriculture. The dairy example is an absolutely perfect one. You don't do that on a 40 cow dairy operation. And so as you think about beef cattle, that automation, I don't think is scale neutral. I think you have to get bigger to afford some of the automation that might be coming. Might make packing plants even need to be bigger just to make sure you have the throughput to pay for that more expensive automation that's in the plant.
I think a really important part to incorporate into this conversation at this time is the skill sets that we're talking about for implementing and maintaining this high automation is a completely different set of skill sets and a different employee than the labor that's in place today. And does the individual that has the computer tech, the software tech skill sets, are they wanting to live in some of these rural communities that these plants or these farms would be located? So there's challenges with that transition as well.
Does that also drive home the quality of life, the investment in rural broadband, those necessities that make living in rural areas? I live in rural Kentucky. I grew up in rural Illinois, where we didn't have broadband access until 6 months ago. Does that investment in those types of projects also become more of a necessity in the big picture of the stability and the productivity of the ag sector?
I have to answer yes pretty quickly to that. The individuals that are going to be interested in coming to those rural areas that have the capability or the background to fill some of those jobs, they're going to have other wants. And I think that just says you have to invest more broadly in those rural communities. You asked me about consumers for a minute, Megan, and I just circle back around to remind us that the cost of products to the retail consumer likely will change, and the emphasis on farm level inputs might be less, and the interest on the cost of processing, et cetera, could go up. So, we often talk about farm to retail spreads, and I go, all of this discussion to me says the spread gets bigger post the farm gate. Yes, we're going to employ technology at the farm level, but consumers should be ready for more cost with this automation, I think, is the answer to the question.
I want to ask, we talk about economies of scale and knowing what the cattle industry has been going through with contraction because of drought, because of production costs, all of the things that are putting pressure on smaller operators. Does that potentially, is there potentially then a shift coming out of rebuilding eventually when we get there? And how concerning is that for the cattle industry as a whole?
I think there's another component to that question that's critically important. And if you look at the age demographics of the typical cow owner today and what they are capable or willing to do, you see a lot of commentary in market press today about the shift in values between first calf heifers and cows, and the cows appreciating in value to a heifer. That's absolutely reversed from historical averages. But just these older producers are unable or don't want that job of and risk of calving out a bunch of heifers. So I think we're already seeing very, very clear signs of what you're talking about. I do see a lot of changes and how these operators perform because just the availability of labor or availability of ability.
How does technology also play a role in this? You talked about like automating, thinking about feed yards, or thinking about the availability of pen riders, if we're going to talk in terms of feedlots as well. Implementation of technologies, does that provide us an opportunity to maybe pull back on our labor needs and be more efficient at the farm level as well?
Perfect example there on the pen riders case is the use of drones and checking pens with drones instead of physically using pen riders. Does it eliminate the requirement to still sort that sick animal out of a pen and get it to a hospital pen? No, we're still going to need that skill. But how we do our job smarter and with the use of technology, I think we're already seeing signs of that. This, in my mind, this easily transitioned into the other area that you wanted to cover today, and that's on the land. But if you look at that technology deal, the availability of labor, and the availability of land, the rotational, the escalation in rotational grazing, the huge increase that we have seen in the last handful of years with more and more calves being produced in a grow yard environment instead of a natural grazing environment. So that in turn opens up more conventional grass for cow-calf production. So I think these two are playing hand in hand together and how we're seeing transition in the industry.
It's a great segue into the other part of our conversation, which is land. Scott, as we look at pasture land, obviously, like other land values, costs have gone up. As it faces competition from other sectors, how do producers remain competitive?
So I think the answer to this question is making sure we're as efficient using that acre of pasture land as we absolutely can be. And there's risk in this discussion because what I need one year it's going to be different than another year depending on the weather that goes along with how much pasture do I need. So you've got to have some, I think, slack, if you will. But I typically look back over time and we've had a lot of slack. And you're going to have to be as efficient on that acre of pasture land as you can. So rotational grazing is a good example of how can I use that as efficiently, that acre as efficiently as possible. At the cost we have today, you I think have to really tighten down the land requirements that you want for a given herd size. I will even say I think this is another one where it's much easier for me to manage a larger operation than it is 40 cows. I probably have the chance to move those cattle around a little bit better as I have more land available. And so, you know, as we talk about both these issues, I keep saying, to me, this changes the structure of the industry from what it's typically been. And we're going to keep seeing, I think, larger and larger cow-calf operations as they grapple with the costs of labor and the costs of.
When I think about this question too, I come with very different answers or avenues when I think about grazing programs in the Western United States and the structure of those businesses, opposed to the East and Southeast complex where you have a lot of small fields that how as operations get bigger, but how you have to manage those facilities just because of the structure of those markets, it's a very different situation. I will say this on the, I agree with Scott that, you know, the best use of that acre. I concur that we're still seeing the loss of acres for urban sprawl. We're still seeing the constraints on public lands, and when that debate ebb and flows. I don't know that I'm as concerned with the available grazing lands today as I've even been at other times. And the reason I say that, I'm going to go back to the increased efficiency of rotational grazing, and we're getting more productivity off of the same number of acres. It's been a number of years now, but I think back to the research that I did some years ago on confined cow-calf production and how it can be absolutely viable. I've already mentioned the fact of more and more calves leaving a grazing platform, whether that be summer grazing or some kind of winter pasture, and going directly into grow yards. I see that continuing to expand. So I think we're going to be more efficient with how we manage those cattle for the resources, but at the same time, that opens up more acres for a conventional cows.
How much does drought come into play when we're thinking about rotational grazing? I mean, you're looking at parts of, I mean, in Missouri, cow-calf country, drought monitor came out today, more drought in that part of the country. I'm in the Eastern Corn Belt, and nearly the entire state is in some light or moderate form of drought. Does that create additional challenges when we're thinking about rotational grazing and buffers and how much land we actually need to be effective if we're looking at persistent declines in yields and productivity?
I think it's a mega driver. When we look back, and Scott made reference a few minutes ago that we've come from an age or backgrounds when we had surplus acres of grass and we just made it, you know, let it work out. Now as that tightens, but it's that variability or uncertainty of production in a natural environment because of moisture levels. That's a key component when we talk about the grow yards and all the various forms of confinement. It's just, while costs are higher, but the reliability and consistency of those gains per animal and the ability to get those animals in and out on an expected timeline it's a huge impact on the vulnerabilities from weather variability.
And I will just add the discussion here of, so you don't go do rotational grazing once a drought has started. The efforts that happen at, I'll say, the cow-calf level have to happen all the time. You want to have surplus building up during good periods of time to try to live through the dry periods of time. You can't wait until the drought happens to say, I'm going to be more efficient with my pasture use. That's boat sailed. And so I think, you know, to what's happening today and in a state like Missouri, it's a difficult situation because we're going to be tight here for a period of time. You know, Don's comment about changing where we grow calves is one of the few alternatives you really have, because that amount of forage you have is relatively fixed at this point. We're not, even a lot of rain right now may not get us a lot more forage between now and fall. It'll take fall growth before we see a whole lot. So you're reducing the risk when you're able to say, I'm going to go grow those calves in a confinement operation. Yes, Don's right, more cost, but it helps then the acres you have left all spread to helping those cows make it. I think I just go, don't respond today because of drought in terms of how you're going to manage that pasture side.
You know, and I would add, I think it's a great topic, and I think there can be built-in versatility in that program where a producer could largely be a grass-based program, but have the facilities and resources on hand that when those conditions don't warrant that natural grazing, have the ability and a place to bottle up those calves and put them in a grow yard environment. The versatility of those joint systems can be a lifesaver for a producer, that he's out of resources.
The beef industry and really the livestock sector in general has that very much just in time or just enough production mentality. But the beef industry is so unique in its ability or inability to make a shift in terms of expansion, those types of things. When we're looking at not just managing drought and managing resources during a drought, how do we transition into an instance where we're not caught off guard, or we're able to think ahead and maybe prepare in times where things aren't as challenging, right? To have the resources available when land availability for grazing or supplies are short in general.
The first answer I'm going to give on that one, when you look at the beef complex in relationship to other protein sources, we constantly have that battle of working with such a long life cycle that we're in or we're out, that we don't have that ability for a 6 to 8 week rollover in broilers, or the 6 to 9 month rollover with pigs. So we don't have a choice but to play the long game and be prepared to deal with the changing environment as it happens. It's just not in the cards.
And I think they're the risk from how consumers behave for us, right? So we're going to run record prices, beef prices at consumers, I think, here over the coming months, relative to a pork or chicken industry that can adjust a little more quickly. So those retail prices aren't as volatile. How do consumers continue to use beef in what is a more, and maybe I should say restaurants and food service, et cetera. So I think this continues to be a struggle for the beef industry. It's not new. We've been down this road for decades, but it's hard to change. I sometimes say this to me makes risk management relative to maybe weather more important from a long-term standpoint. And at least we now have some tools in the toolbox for producers to look at some of those rainfall kinds of products that are out there to try to help with some of the volatility that we see from a weather standpoint.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would, when it comes to that consumer preference, I think it even places more of an emphasis on the beef industry continuing to strive for that higher quality and that assurance of a satisfying eating experience every time. That because when we go through these challenges and we're going to have a price disproportionate to other proteins, we have to continue to provide that reason for producers continue to buy beef even when it's at the higher prices.
Gosh, what a great story to tell on the beef side of things, right? Just the amount of quality and the amount of risk management that producers invested into genetics to consistently provide a better than average and enjoyable eating experience for the product. I don't know if that gets enough attention sometimes about how smart the industry was to make that investment and to make that focus.
But it never ends, right? So once you start down the road, the quality that we have today is better than the quality we had 5 years ago. And the quality we're going to have 5 years down the road is going to be even better. The competition changes all the time. You can't get off of this road of, because you want to distinguish yourself. You don't want to be, so if I'm the beef industry, I don't want pork or chicken to be a substitute product. I want consumers to look at beef differently. And I think that's what the industry's done so well. It's been this quality focus that how many times do you see consumers who, if you ask them, what do you want to have if you want a really good meal? And they'll say steak. That isn't by accident. I think that's the industry that's really identified as this premium product that I'm going to go consume when I want to have a really good meal regardless. But don't think the pork and chicken industries are sitting idly by, not trying to work on the same quality focus as well. So don't ever quit is always my answer.
You know, I was recently on a road trip where I was touring a lot of the cow-calf areas. And the thing that really stuck out to me from thinking back in days when I was out there on an everyday basis, but when you get into those big cow-calf areas today and just drive by one operation to the next, how much quality improvement has happened above the board, that just the consistency that's out there today, we just don't have that huge variation in quality that we had. And I agree with Scott completely. The increase in quality, even though we've got a choice and prime grading percentage today consistently in that 80 to 82% range, I think it's going to continue to get better.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. Any final thoughts as we think about labor and land and producers' bottom lines? Did I stump you?
You did. You know, the thing I would, it may not be the positive note we'd like to close on, but I think the real takeaway from this whole conversation, and particularly on the labor side, is this is going to be an ongoing issue. It's probably going to get even tighter than where we're at today. So it is clearly an area that is going to demand a lot of attention and a lot of creativity as we go forward.
And I will add just change. So what the industry looks like today and what it's going to look like going forward with the kinds of land and labor constraints that are coming means you have to continue to adjust or you get left behind is part of my answer to this. And so I just encourage everyone to think about how they need to manage their operation differently going forward in what's going to be these constraints, as Don very rightly said, don't go away anytime soon. Higher land costs and lack of labor availability are going to be discussions that we have for many years forward.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your comments and your insights into this.
You're more than welcome.
Thanks, Megan.
I'm Megan Grebner with The Bottom Line on Brownfield. Thank you for tuning in to our YouTube channel. For all the latest in ag news, markets, and weather, and for more great video content, go to brownfieldagnews.com.